As a kid, I had often been afraid of things that go bump in the night. I remember this happening ever since my parents had divorced, back in 1965, when I was 4 or 5 years old, and my mom was raising my younger brother and I as a single mom. Maybe the divorce made me insecure and frightened of things in general. I'm not talking about anything I could pinpoint as ghostly. Mostly, I was just terrified of noises I heard or thought I had heard. Footsteps outside my window, logically explained as this was when I had lived in an apartment complex. I lived in many places as a child, and later on, thinking I would hear someone walking on our carpet, in the hallway, in the middle of the night. Something was always seeming to be scaring me, though. For instance, when I was 5, I was temporarily living with my grandparents right after my mom had moved us to Arizona from Texas. One morning, I woke up on the floor next to my bed, although that didn't particularly frighten me since I had figured I simply had fallen off the bed. During the night, I do remember another night waking up and calling out for my aunt in a panic because, I swear, something was shaking my bed. She came in and lay down with me for a few moments. The shaking stopped after that and never repeated itself. She explained to me I was having a nightmare, which I matter-of-factly accepted, and which also left me with the impression for years afterwards that one had to be fully awake to experience a nightmare. To this day, although I know now I was not dreaming, I still don't know why my bed was shaking like that. Since this happened in Mesa, Arizona, it was not likely to have been caused by an earthquake either. Fast forward about 10 years. My mom had remarried another man who became our legal father when he adopted my brother and I. We lived in a ranch-style house, which were very common in the Southwest in the 60s and 70s, and that my folks had purchased and built as a brand new tract home several years earlier. So this isn't a story about moving into some mysterious and really old home with a lot of weird vibes. It was just your typical new home that everyone seemed to be moving into back in the days of early suburban sprawl in the Phoenix area. Like I said, I had always been afraid of noises, and I was always imagining hearing footsteps on the carpet outside the doorway. I never saw or heard anything else. I was just creeped out by thinking I had heard footsteps. In my honest opinion, the ventilation coming from the central heating and air conditioning was probably the most likely culprit. When my dad was assigned to go overseas in 1974, I did see something that terrified the living daylights out of me. I was a freshman in high school. By then, I had mostly gotten over the footsteps on the carpet heebie-jeebies. My mom, out of habit, began to leave the kitchen lights on at night. I slept with my door open because the light coming in from the hallway offered a sense of warmth and comfort, as it probably did my mom. Except, on this particular night, I remember waking up, looking at my little red travel alarm clock I always kept by the bed. I could see it was exactly 1:20 a.m. For some reason, I glanced over at my door, and what I saw literally petrified me. From the diffused kitchen lighting, I could see the distinct shadow of a human form cast onto the hallway wall outside my bedroom. What was even more particularly frightening to me was that this wasn't just a shadow that happened to look like a figure. It was actually moving slowly towards my bedroom door. And to make it even more terrifying, I could hear footsteps on the carpet as it came closer. I could only watch in utter horror because I was not in any way thinking that this was a ghost I was seeing, but a real flesh and blood intruder that had broken into our home and was sneaking into one of our rooms to attack us. But I was way too scared to scream or do anything but watch and wait for this person to show up in front of my doorway. But that didn't happen. The shadow just stopped advancing and faded away. I could only sit and stare at my doorway for what seemed the longest time, but nothing else happened. Finally, all I could do was jump out of bed, run across the hallway, which was empty of any intruder, and into my mom's room and wake her up to tell her what I had seen. In her half-asleep state, she brushed it off to my overactive imagination. I fell into a fitful sleep next to her, and when I checked the doors and windows the next morning, everything was secure, so I pretty much didn't think about it much after that. Except that isn't quite the end of the story. About a year later, after my dad was back home from his overseas assignment, I woke up again late one Saturday night and heard someone moving around in the kitchen hallway and could see their shadows as they moved about, cast onto the hallway from the kitchen light, which was left on. I knew it was probably my dad, since he had a habit of falling asleep on the couch in front of the TV. Long after sign-off, the stations would end their broadcast for the evening, and the station would be off the air with nothing but static on the channel. So I thought he was just getting up to go to bed, but I didn't hear anything else, so I got up to see what he was doing. When I walked into the kitchen, no one was there, but at the end of the room, which was our family room off from the kitchen, my dad was sound asleep and snoring in front of the TV, which was just showing static since it was off the air. The weird part was, it looked like he hadn't moved in hours, let alone a few minutes ago. That is when I started to get a very creepy feeling about what I just saw and how it wasn't jiving with what I was seeing now. I could only run back to my room and try not to think about it. I haven't had any other experiences with seeing shadow figures and would tend not to believe in the paranormal if it wasn't for all the stories I've heard, not just on the internet, but from my friends and family. But that was just a little too weird for me to ignore, as something just being my imagination and don't have any clue what it was I was seeing all those years ago. It's not as exciting as other stories I've read here, but I remember being scared so badly at the time that I am at least grateful it's not something I've had to deal with as a regular occurrence throughout my life. I encountered this entity quite a few months ago, close to the beginning of the month while walking my dog, but the experience stays fresh in my mind no matter how many days come to pass, for it still leaves me uneasy. It was on a clear night with a full moon that I decided to take my dog on a walk due to not being able to fall back asleep. I pulled on a simple jacket to keep me warm in my shirt and pajama pants, let my dog out of her kennel to clip on her leash, and left my home quietly as my family slept. It was in the early morning hours that I had woken up, but it wasn't the first time, so this was a somewhat normal occurrence for me at that point. I thought that it was just going to be a simple walk down the street to the mailbox and back. Boy, was I wrong. It was silent as I made my way down our dirt road. Not even the birds were making noises in the trees as I walked past and would have normally woken them up. My dog Tess would let out an uneasy whine every now and again, but I just took it as her being the scaredy dog she was, and probably was whining about her own shadow. As we neared the end of the street, only about 10 or so feet away from the mailbox, she suddenly started moving in closer to me, and I felt my vision almost vibrate as I turned my head due to suddenly feeling like something was pressing down on me while a loud buzzing filled my head. I don't know why, for it was sort of instantaneous with the sudden buzzing and pressure I was feeling in my head, but I glanced to the side and saw something standing in the bushes on the side of the road. It looked like a man, and yet not. It had no clothes on and was tall with rather long limbs and sickly white skin that just the sight alone almost made me want to throw up. The thing's face is what scared me the most, I believe, for it had no nose but piercing yellow eyes and a leering grin of a smile on its wide mouth that looked like it almost split from ear to ear, though not quite. Other than these features in its body shape, there was nothing else to identify it as a male. Not that I really had time to double check, as it disappeared and the pressure and buzzing noise went away. Once it did, I could hear Tess freaking out as she tried to slip out of her leash while backing up and whining loudly. But I quickly turned and ran back home with her following, then running ahead. Once I was home and in my room, I instantly jumped back into bed and pulled the blankets over my head to feel safe again, as I realized just how much that thing had scared me. To this day, I don't know what I saw, nor have I seen it again, but thinking back on my experience, I don't think I want to. It was Easter Sunday, 1992. I was 7 years old. All of my mom's brothers and sisters and their children had gathered at my maternal grandmother's house, like usual. After lunch, the adults had an egg hunt for all the kids. Anyway, the egg hunt was over, and all my cousins and I were headed to the backyard to collect our prizes. For some reason, I stopped about 20 yards short of the group and stared at the hillside. The back of my grandmother's backyard was, and still is, lined with forsythia bushes. The bushes were not in full bloom, but were starting to bloom. From what I remember about the sun, it had to have been around 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Anyway, as I stared into the bush, this white shape, neither solid nor transparent, started forming out of nowhere. It seemed to be spinning while it expanded and contracted. At this time, I became aware that there was a very tall presence behind me, almost touching me. I thought the presence was my older cousin, who was a teenager and twice my height. So I spun around and said, "Lee, look at that," and spun back around. Instantaneously, I realized that Lee was not behind me and never had been, and the white blob was gone. I felt alone again. I looked over and realized my family was some distance off and had not seen or noticed a single thing. I think it needs to be said now that I am very skittish. I'm terrified of the dark and always have been. Just the thought of possibly seeing a ghost or demon or presence scares me. I've always been like that. However, in this situation, I was calm, more than calm. I know at some point in time, I told my mother, grandmother, aunt, and father about this. For a long time, they tried to convince me that what I saw was a cat or a grocery bag in the wind. I always maintained that it was an unknown form. Years passed, and my mother would occasionally bring this topic up with me to see if I remembered anything else. My story has always been the same. However, she pointed out something about 6 months ago that I had never realized. For years, I'd put emphasis on the blob. It had never occurred to me that I had not been mistaken about my cousin's presence behind me. Perhaps I just couldn't see the presence. Then she suggested that the presence could have been her father. He had died when my mother was 5 or 6. My mother and I are practically identical, so much so that in my adult life, I've seen pictures of her and thought they were me. My mother suggests that the presence was her father, just checking up on his little girl. For some reason, this helped put the mystery of why I saw the blob to bed. Now I feel like I understand, or at least have a more complete understanding.